Hello, class. So today we are going to talk about altruism. For better or worse, in psychology, we often focus on the ways in which human behaviors are suboptimal, selfish, or wrong. We do so because we want to understand how social behavior works and how to make it better. But it can be a little bit negative. But humans also do incredible things. We help others at a cost to ourselves, and we have great empathy for those around us. We give up our lives to help others, and so this behavior is called pro-social behavior, and it's going to be the topic of our discussion today. First, I want to talk about some of the examples related to humans' amazing feats that ordinary people can be extraordinary heroes. So perhaps one of humans' most amazing feats is the fact that ordinary people can be extraordinary heroes. Right? Everyone can think of an example of someone who's an extraordinary hero. Here's my favorite example of Wells Crowther. He died in the September 11 attacks in order to save 18 other people. And so he's become sort of a symbol of a selfless, heroic human being. So feel free to click on the link in with his name, Wells Crowther, and watch a video about his story. It's truly like a really remarkable and inspiring story. So feel free to pause this video and watch his story and then come back to our lesson. All right, so this is our learning outcome number 1. First, let's talk about pro-social behavior and altruism and distinguish between these two terms. What you just saw with the story of Wells Crowther, the fact that he sacrificed himself to save 18 other people, is an example of what social psychologists would call pro-social behavior. So pro-social behavior is an act performed with the goal of benefiting another person. So there's a lot of way we can help other people in our everyday life. Some of those instances have good intentions, and others because we hope to get something in return by helping other people. Right? So researchers thus distinguish between pro-social behavior and altruism. Altruism is helping others purely out of the desire to benefit someone else with no benefit and often cost to ourselves. So Wells Crowther really clearly was engaged in an act of altruism. He was risking his own life, so that's a huge cost, right? Maybe that's the ultimate cost to himself by helping other people, and ultimately lost his life in service of others. So take a minute and think of the times when you were altruistic or when you were doing something to help other people. So it doesn't have to be big. Maybe you help your grandparents with a computer task, or when you give money to a homeless person, gave up seat on the bus for a pregnant woman, babysat a neighbor's kid in a pinch. So think about some of the pro-social actions that you've done for others. So clearly, you probably be able to think of some pro-social behavior that you've done, right? So it seems like we all are capable of, helping other people's. We all inclined to help other people's across situations. Um, so it seems to be universal. So why do we help others, right? Well, is it in our genes? That answer might be partially correct. But evolutionary psychologists might say that we help certain others in order to help our genes. So think about this scenario. Who are you going to help, right? So let's say the house is burning. There are three people asleep in different rooms in this burning house. Who are you going to save? You only have time to pick one person only. So your 21-year-old friend, your 75-year-old grandfather, and your 21-year-old cousin. So the chances are your gut reactions was to help your cousin. Why? Because he's young and he's family. And why would you help family? We have sayings such as blood is thicker than water. But why? So it turns out people are more likely to help their family, their kin, when the stakes are life-threatening. And psychologists call this kin selection. Right? Although people are not more likely to help genetic relatives when the situation is non-life-threatening, both males and females, both Americans and Japanese participants follow the rule of kin selection in life-threatening situations. So why do we, save our relatives in life-threatening situations? Why do we prioritize saving, our blood in life-threatening situations? Psychologists, especially evolutionary psychologists, say that we do this because this action helps to propagate our genes. Right. So, according to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, natural selection would favor genes that promote the survival of the individual. Right. So, according to this theory, any genes that further the survival and increases the probability of producing offspring would likely to be passed on, and genes that lower the chance of survival and reduce the chances of producing offspring is going to be less likely to be passed on. So according to this theory, pro-social behavior and altruism wouldn't even exist if it weren't evolutionarily useful, because if it's not useful, then it's not going to be passed on. So now it's kind of interesting, right? Because altruistic behavior seems to run counter to evolution and natural selection, because when helping others, especially in life-threatening situation, we put ourselves at risk. And people who are altruistic, might run the risk of dying and thus producing fewer offspring themselves. So why don't we always act selfishly? Well, evolutionary psychologists use the notion of kin selection to explain this dilemma. We prefer saving our kin in life-threatening situations because our kin share our genetics. And by helping them in life-threatening situations, we increase the chance of our genes being passed on. Now think again about who you helped lately for a second. Were you exclusively helping your relatives? Of course not. Humans often help others who they're not related to. So this is our learning outcome number 2. So why do we help people who are not related to us? According to the social exchange theory, the relationship between two people is created through a process of cost-benefit analysis. So when we help other people, we receive reward, and it also costs us some resources. So we try to balance the cost and benefit analysis. And the reward we receive might be internal, for example, positive emotions, a sense of satisfaction. We might build a self-image that is positive, right, and altruistic. We also receive external reward. For example, we might receive the liking and adulation from other people. We might build relationships with other people. As an example of reward, the research has shown that giving away money increase what experts call subjective wealth. So how well off you feel instead of objective wealth. Right? So when people give $500, it has the same effect on feelings of subjective wealth as earning an extra $10,000 in income. So in some way, people who give their money away could be because it made them feel good or superior to giving away money. There's also a lot of cost to helping, and potential cost is taken into account in people's decision to help. And Darley and Batson in 1970 did an experiment that demonstrated the effect of the cost of helping in the decision to help. So in their study, they asked students in a religious seminary to prepare a speech for presentations to other students. Right, so half of the group is assigned to prepare a talk on altruistic Good Samaritan, and the other half prepare a talk on jobs. So the expectation is that if students talk about the Good Samaritan, it would prime the concept of prosociality for these students, and so when they prepare this talk, they would be more likely to help other people. Right? So after these students prepare their talk, these religion students were asked to walk to a nearby building where the speech would be recorded. And so here's where the second independent variable come into play. A third of the students were told that they need to hurry because they're running late. Another third were told that they have enough time. And the last third of the students were told that they have plenty of time, so they have plenty of time to get there. And on the way to the other building, students all pass a person who seems to be in distress, who actually was a research confederate. And the researcher measured through observations and rating the degree of helping that the seminary students would give to the person. So what did the results show? The results show that overall the topic of the talk, the Good Samaritan versus job talk, did not have a significant effect on helping. In contrast, the time pressure did make a difference. So for students who had a lot of time, 63% of them offer help. For those who have moderate amount of time, 45% offer help. And for those who thought they were late, only 10% stopped to help the person in need. So basically time is a cost here. And so when we have less time to help, right, it's very costly to help. And so people just don't help when they don't have enough time resources. So another factors that influence whether we help or not, besides cost-benefit analysis, is social norms. So the first social norm is social norm of responsibility, which basically say that we should try to help others who need assistance even without any expectations of future payback. So even if we don't benefit from helping, we should still do. So you can think of a sort of cliche saying in superhero movie, with great power come great responsibility, right? So that is inconsistent with the social responsibility norm, is that we have the responsibility to help the people who are weak, who are in need. Well, the second social norm is reciprocity norm. So this norm basically say that if someone help us, then we should help them in the future. And if we help people now, they will probably help us later if we need it. So basically the idea is I scratch your back, you scratch mine. And evolutionary psychologists argue that reciprocal altruism or the norm of reciprocity is evolutionary advantageous because it's helped both us survive and the people around us to survive better since we reciprocally help one another. So this sort of framework has led to some researcher to argue that altruism is an illusion and there's no such thing as true prosociality because cause and benefits are always the determinants of prosocial behavior. So what do you guys think? All right, so this is our learning outcome number 3. The emotions people feel play an important role in pro-social behavior. Helping others make people feel good, and people are also more likely to help when they're feeling good. So helping and doing act of kindness, helping other, is a way that people create and maintain their good mood. So this is very much in line with the internal reward people derive when helping other. Right? It's a benefit of helping other people. However, if people think that helping is going to spoil their good mood, so you can think of a scenario when helping would force people to confront very distressing scenes, for example, in an emergency room where people are dying, or when they have to face, let's say, extreme poverty and it's caused a lot of distress when we see other people suffering, then people who are in good mood are likely to refuse to help because they don't want to spoil their good mood by having to confront such unpleasant scenes. Right? So creating and maintaining good mood is sort of a selfish motivation for helping, but it do happen regularly. In contrast, certain negative moods also promote helping. For example, when people feel guilty, they're more likely to do pro-social behavior. Why? Because guilt is an emotion that signal to ourselves that we've done something wrong to other people, we've hurt our relationships with other people in some way, and therefore it motivates us to try to repair those relationships, try to do something that is socially good to mend the relationship to be accepted into the social group again. So when people feel guilty, they're more likely to perform pro-social behavior to sort of mend the social relationship. And this is not only limited to the social target that we have done something wrong to, it's actually also generalized to other people. So we might feel guilty about doing something wrong to our friend, but as a result, we will actually be more helpful to other people beside our friend. Another emotion that is central to helping is empathy. Daniel Basson is the strongest proponent of the idea that people often help purely out of the goodness of their heart. He acknowledges that people sometimes help others for selfish reasons, such as to relieve their own distress at seeing another person suffer, but he also argues that people's motives are sometimes purely altruistic, in that their only goal is to help other people, even if doing so involves some cost for themselves. Right? So he said that pure altruism is likely to come into play when we feel empathy for the person in need, putting ourselves in their shoes, experiencing the emotions and thoughts they would be likely to feel. So when you help a homeless person by giving him a sandwich, and you feel empathy, it's not because you want others on the street to think that you're great or because you want to feel better about yourself. It's because you feel what it must be like to be hungry and cold without a home and are therefore motivated to help this person. Basson argues that at times, the times when you don't feel empathy, when helping other people, is where social exchange theory would comes into play, because you're helping out of your own self-interest, right? So to recap, empathy altruism hypothesis referred to the idea that when we feel empathy for a person, we will attempt to help that person purely for altruistic reasons, regardless of what we have to gain. Empathy and personal distress is frequently mixed up, so we should distinguish these two kind of emotions. Personal distress refers to the negative emotions that we may experience when we view another person suffering. So we might feel, disturbed, perturbed, distressed when we see somebody suffering. And personal distress do motivate helping. It is because we feel so uncomfortable. We feel the personal distress. We might try to help to relieve our own personal distress. Or we might try to escape the scene. We might try to avoid seeing other people suffering to stop our distress. That's another way. Empathy is different. Empathy refers to an affective response in which a person would understand or even feels another person's distress and experiences, even the way the other person does. So these two kind of emotions both might motivate helping for different reasons. Right? Personal distress motivated helping to relieve ourselves of our own distress, whereas empathy motivated helping to relieve the other persons of their distress. So how do we distinguish these two motives? One is selfish and the other is selfless. Basson and College attempted to answer these questions with a series of studies. So here's one of the study. They recruit college students, inviting them into the lab, and these students would be told that they'll watch another person of the same sex doing a series of tasks in the next room. And as part of the experiment, the other persons who these participants are watching also supposedly receive some mild electric shocks. And so the students who are doing the observing of other people getting shocks, and these people getting shocks are actually just Confederate. So these students who do the observing were randomly assigned to one of the two experimental conditions. One condition is the easy escape conditions. So they were told that the other person would go through 10 shock trials, but they only need to watch the first 2 trials, after which they can leave. The other group were assigned into a difficult escape condition. So basically, they are told that they need to watch all 10 of the shock trials. So they need to see the other, the Confederate getting shocked for like 10 straight trials. So during the second trial, the person in the other room, who's actually the Confederate, would look as if he or she was experiencing some kind of discomfort, right? And he or she would ask for a break, for a glass of water. So during this break, the experimenter entered into the observation room and gave the research participant a questionnaire asking the research participants how they were feeling. And so they would rate their feelings on, distressing feelings such as alarm, grief, upset, worry, disturbed, etc., or empathy, whether they feel sympathetic, moved, compassion, warm, soft-hearted, tender, etc. So this is the second independent variable, but it was not manipulated. The researcher simply classified the participants into two groups: the group of participants who predominantly feeling distress, or the group of participants who predominantly feel empathy for the person who is getting shocked. And so afterward, the experimenter asked participants, okay, the other persons who are getting shocked is not feeling so well. Would you be willing to take some of the shock trials for them? So here the dependent variable the researcher is measuring is the number of shock trials participants were willing to take for the other persons. So what did they find? The researcher basically find that for participants who feel empathy, they were moderately willing to help the other person. So there's no differences in the empathy conditions for how many of the shock trial they're willing to take for the other person, right? So for the when they have to watch 2 trial versus when they have to watch 10 trial, they're willing to take from 4 to 5 shock trials for the other person. However, for the participants who predominantly felt distress when watching people getting shocked, when it's easy for them to escape the sight of people getting shocked, when they only have to watch 2 trial, they're only offer on average to take 1 shock trial. However, when they were forced to watch the other person getting shocked, they're willing to take 5 trials, which indicate that when it's difficult for them to escape this sight, they're willing to help to relieve themselves of their own distress. For people who feel empathy, it didn't matter whether they have to see it or they don't have to see it. They still feel empathy for the other persons and still willing to help. So this is how the researcher was able to disentangle these 2 emotional motives for helping. One is selfish, to relieve oneself of distress, and the other one is more selfless, to simply alleviate the suffering of other people. So what precedes empathy? So there's a lot of factors that would cause us to feel more or less empathetic to people. So here are some of the factors. One is to feel empathy, we need to perceive others people as being in need. If we feel that they don't need help, then we don't really feel empathy for them. We must also value the other's welfare. That's a given. If we don't care about their well-being, we would not feel empathy for them if they're suffering. Another factor is when we perceive some kind of innocence in other people. Like, for example, when we see baby, they're cute, they're innocent, and if they're crying, we would feel empathy for them. Another factor that is very, very important is perceived similarity. So when we see that other people are similar to us, it's easier to empathize with them. Similarity here could be sharing interests, sharing life experiences, being from the same country, being in the same social group. And so when we perceive other people as being similar to us, we're more likely to empathize with their experience, and we are also more likely to help. Another way to feel empathy for another person is to take their perspective, right? Putting yourself in their shoes and sort of imagine how the experience would be from their point of view. And that's also helped to foster more empathetic emotions. All right, so as a recap, we've identified 3 basic motives for helping. Evolutionary motives, which is to pass on our genes. There's also social exchange motives, which is to maximize reward and minimize the cost of helping. And the sort of empathetic altruistic motives, which is when we feel a powerful feelings of empathy and compassion, we're more likely to help other people selflessly. So each of these approaches has its supporters and critics, and there's a debate that's always going on about whether there could be pure altruism or not. So with that, this is our essay option number 1. Okay, feel free to pause the video and read the essay prompt. So this is our learning outcome number 4. There are dispositional factors that influence whether a person would help other people or not. The first factor is altruistic or pro-social personality. And people who are high in pro-social or altruistic personality are often more helpful than others across a variety of situations. And these people also have strong other concern. Right? They like to be with, to relate to, and to help other people. Another factor is religiousness. So in surveys, religious people often say that they are more helpful than other non-religious people. But whether they really help when helping conflicts with self-interest really depends on what type of religious person they are. So the people who are religious for personal reasons related to self-concern, such as not going to hell or to avoid punishment, are generally not necessarily more helpful than the general populations. On the other hand, the people who are more quest-oriented, which mean those who really believe that helping is an important part of religious experience, are likely to help, even when doing so require effort and a lot of cost. And so furthermore, religion is not the only thing that makes us helpful. Right? So being reminded of other social norms such as our civic duty or our civil responsibility to help others also make us more pro-social and more likely to help other people. So besides dispositional factors, there's also factors such as group differences. There could be differences between gender, across social groups, or across culture. There's also situational pressures that we will discuss in the next learning outcome. So let's talk about gender differences in altruism. Here's a scenario for you. So think of a person who performs dramatic, heroic act like storming the cockpit of the United Flight 93 to fight the terrorists. Now think of someone who is involved in a long-term helping relationship like assisting a disabled neighbor with chores around the house. For the first example, do you think of a man or a woman? For the second example, do you think of a man or a woman? So typically, people would sort of imagine an image of a man for the first example and imagine an image of someone like a woman or nurse in the second example, right? So in virtually all cultures, norms would describe different traits and behaviors for male and females, learned as boys and girls are grown up. So the sort of cultural norms prescribed for men are often characteristic by being chivalrous and heroic. Right? So a striking finding shows that 95% of people who receive medals from the Carnegie Hero Fund commissions for risking their lives to save a stranger have been men. And for women, the stereotype or the prescribed role is to be nurturing and caring. And women are expected to value close, long-term relationships. Studies have found that women do help more in long-term nurturing relationships than men do, and that women are somewhat more likely to engage in volunteer work than men, especially when the volunteer work involves, helping other people in their community. There's also differences between social groups in altruism, and one of the big differences is people are more likely to help in-group than out-group members. However, there's some differences in this tendency between conservative and liberals. So overall, conservatives are more charitable than liberals. However, conservatives' charity is more in-group focused. For example, a lot of charity donations or charity work done by conservatives are geared toward benefiting the church or religion. Another difference between conservative and liberal is that conservatives tend to have stronger just world beliefs. And what is just world belief? It's a belief that people deserve what they get in life. So when you hold just world belief, you probably would think that successful people are successful because they work hard and smart. And poor people are poor because they're lazy and irresponsible. And this just world belief has consequences for helping, right? Because we help other people when we think that they deserve help. So when we perceive that someone have brought on their own problems or who are working very hard to solve the problems on their own, then we're less likely to help these people. We're less willing to help these people who sort of like deserve their own misfortune, in a sense. So therefore, if you hold a stronger just world beliefs, believing that people who sort of like are suffering deserve their suffering because for whatever reason they're lazy, they're not working hard, they're irresponsible, they make bad choice, then you would not wanting to help them, and as a result, conservatives tend to have lower support for welfare program across the board that benefit people who need help. Whereas on the opposite, liberal are less likely to hold just world belief. They likely to think that people, the reason why people are not doing well is structural, is environmental, is the circumstances that sort of put people in a bad place. As a result, liberals tend to have higher support for a welfare program. There are also differences in prosocial behavior in individualistic cultures versus collectivistic cultures. And individualistic culture tend to be Western cultures, although that's not always true. But an example of an individualistic culture is American culture. Collectivistic culture tend to be Asian cultures. So East Asian culture like Japan or China, or South Asian culture like India is a typical example of countries with collectivistic cultures. So the difference between these two kind of culture is in individualistic culture, people see themselves as independent, self-sufficient individuals, right? So in the culture, their messages encourage you to be unique, to be self-sufficient, to express yourself, to not care too much about what other people think. Just kind of like do your own thing. The opposite is encouraged in collectivistic culture. So the cultural goal is to maintain social harmony, to be mindful of how you affect other people, to do what's best for your family and your community, to blend in. And in the former kind of culture, individualistic culture, self-concern is more important. Whereas in collectivistic culture, other concerns is more important. So the differences between these two kind of culture translate into helping behavior. So in a study, researchers find that children and adults in the U.S. which is an individualistic culture, were less likely than children and adults in India, a collectivistic culture, to believe that people have an obligation to help other people. Right? So Indian respondents believe that there was an absolute requirement to help, whereas Americans offer their helping more selectively, even to their friends. So that's the first differences between these two kind of culture. Um, Moreover, because of the strong individualistic norms in the U.S., sometimes it is even inappropriate to try to help in case where we do not have a personal interest in helping. So how do we get people to help? Well, we give them some kind of self-interest in helping, and that's what a lot of fundraising events in the US do. Is the fundraisers would try to sell some sort of products like bake sales, Girl Scout cookies, car washes, and use the profit from the fundraising to donate to their charitable causes. And so this could be sort of like an example of the subtle role of self-interest norms in helping other people. So these fundraisers are giving people a self-interest reasons to help, right? Because they're getting some kind of products in return for the helping. An example of the self-interest norm in helping is illustrated by the study by Ratner and Miller in 2001. So the researcher had participants read a scenario in which a governmental funding agency was planning to reduce funding for research regarding a disease. And so the disease was said to only affect men or women, and participants were asked whether to indicate whether they were opposed to the reductions in funding and how comfortable they would be in attending a meeting to protest the funding changes. So all participants share the same attitude. Right? They would oppose the reduction in fundings regarding whether the disease affect their own sex or the opposite sex. However, men would be less likely to feel comfortable to attend a meeting to oppose the reduction in the funding if the disease only affected women and vice versa. So this sort of illustrates the fact that people would feel sort of less comfortable or less appropriate to carry out a pro-social behavior that is not consistent with the norms of self-interest. So this is our learning outcome number 5. So besides group and individual differences in the tendency to perform pro-social behavior, there's also situational factors, sort of immediate situational factors that influence pro-social behavior. So let's briefly review the bystander effect. We have discussed it in the past. Darley, according to Latane and Darley, the greater numbers of bystanders there is to witness an emergency, the less likely any one of the bystander is going to help the victim. Right? So this is called a bystander effect. According to Latane and Darley, there's a process that we must go through from the emergency happen to the actual actions of intervening and helping. So first, the person who's in the situation must notice the event, that someone is needing help or some emergency has happened. And a barrier that happened there is the person might be distracted, they might be in a hurry, so they might fail to notice the emergency. And when we notice the emergency, we must interpret the event as an emergency. So this is where pluralistic ignorance might come in, because no one seems to jump in and help. We might interpret that, well, people might know something that I don't know, and there might be no need to help. However, the pluralistic ignorance here is that everyone is thinking the same thing. So we must interpret the event, we must overcome this barrier and interpret the event as an emergency. And then the next step is we have to assume responsibility to help. And this is where the third barrier comes in, is when there are a lot of people in an emergency situation, there's a diffusion of responsibility. No one seems to want to assume personal responsibility because they think that other people should. Right? So we need to assume the responsibility that it is our job to help someone. The fourth step is we need to know the appropriate form of assistance. And if we lack knowledge or we don't feel like we are capable of helping, then we also don't help. And then the final step is after we think that we should help and we know how to help, we also sort of weight the other factors such as danger to ourselves, legal concern, embarrassment. So we consider the cost of helping. And if it's too high, it can prevent us from helping. Right? So we need to overcome the last hurdle to actually implement the decision to help. And that would lead to helping. So that's the quick review of the bystander effect. Let's think of this scenario. Suppose you're walking down the street one day when you see a man fall down and cry out with pain. He rolls up his pants leg, revealing a bandaged shin that is bleeding heavily. Would you stop and help? The results show that in small towns, 50% of people would stop and help, whereas in larger city, only 15% would stop and help this person. This result has been replicated with a variety of situations that call for help, such as finding a lost child, give directions, or return a lost letter. And this finding the difference between urban and rural context in pro-social behavior have been replicated in the United States, Canada, Israel, Australia, Turkey, Great Britain, and Sudan. Right? So this is sort of a universal differences between urban and rural environment. So why is there such difference? Is small town folks more likely to internalize altruistic values? So researchers find that this is not the case. Right? So small town people who visit larger cities are also less likely to help. So researcher has proposed the urban overload hypothesis, which say that people living in cities are constantly being bombarded with stimulation and therefore they keep to themselves to avoid being overwhelmed by these stimulations. So according to this urban overload hypothesis, if you put urban dweller in a calmer, less stimulating environment, they would be just as likely as anyone else to reach out to other people. Consistent with the urban overload hypothesis, researchers find that the population density of a city is negatively correlated with helping by people who are living in that city. And it's not only where you live that matters, but how often you have moved from one place to another matters for helping. In places with high residential mobility, especially in larger cities compared to smaller towns, right? People don't live in a place for a long time. They constantly move. They move from place to place. And this results in high residential mobility. When people have lived in a place for a long time, they have the time to integrate into their community, right? So people who live in a place for a long time would be more likely to engage in pro-social behaviors. They have greater attachment to the community. They have more interdependence with their neighbors, and they have greater concerns with one's reputations because they live there for a long time. So this could explain the differences between urban and rural in terms of pro-social behavior. In rural area, people live there for most of their life, if not all of their life, and so their sense of community um, is high. Right? People are more integrated into their community; they're more likely to be pro-social. Whereas in urban area, people constantly move. There's people from all over the place go into a city and they move home very frequently. They're less likely to feel a sense of community and therefore might be less likely to perform pro-social behavior and care about others. And with that, this is our essay option number 2. All right, so this is the end of module 12.